We are looking at the book of 1 Samuel. We come to the 8th chapter of the book. Samuel has been judging Israel for a long time. His whole life, he had spent serving in the temple before the Ark of the Covenant was taken. He had become the judge that everyone looked to. He had integrity. He had a real heart for people. He had a real heart for God. And God had used him in a mighty way to reunite the nation of Israel. And now Samuel's getting old. He's ready to pass the torch. He's ready to raise up the next generation to take over the work of the ministry. But there was a problem. Samuel's sons, who he was ready to pass it to, didn't have his same heart. They didn't really understand the heart of God. And so Samuel is in a very difficult position. Notice what happens. We're going to begin in chapter 8. Let's read verses 1 through 5 and then we'll back up. It says, "And it came to pass when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of the firstborn was Joel. The name of the second, Abijah. And they were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain. They took bribes. They perverted justice. And the elders of Israel gathered together, and they came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said, look, you're old. I mean, that's always a eye-opening. Someone comes up to you and says, you're old. I guess it wasn't rude then. Just so you know, it's rude now. So don't think about it. You're old. And your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." Now, it's interesting that Samuel would place his sons in a position of leadership over spiritual matters. He had seen what had happened to Eli's sons. He had saw how perverted and immoral the tabernacle had become because of Eli putting his sons in that position when they weren't called, when they weren't really, having a desire or a heart for God or didn't have integrity in their own lives. I don't think it was Samuel's example that they were following. You see, it tells us that Samuel was a man of great integrity. His issue is that he handed over his position and his responsibility to sons who didn't have that same heart. And it's amazing because ministry is never a job. It's not just something that gets passed down. Ministry is something that's a calling. It has to be a call by God. And you would think if anyone would have learned that lesson, it would have been Samuel. And Samuel makes the same mistake that Eli did. Now, everyone else recognized that these boys, Joel and Abijah, had a different spirit about them. They didn't have the same passion for the Lord. They didn't have the same concern for the people, that they were really concerned about themselves. And they were taking bribes. They were perverting justice. They were doing things that misrepresented God. And so they come to Samuel. They said, Samuel, we don't want your boys to rule over us. We don't want them to be in that position. Would you give us a king just like the other nations? Now, God didn't design the nation of Israel to be a monarchy. A monarchy is when man rules over the people. God designed the nation of Israel to be a theocracy. God reigning over the people. And as God was speaking to the prophet or to the judge, and he would relay to the people what God is declaring, so that God was the one who had the rule and the authority over the people, not man. Anytime you put man in a position to be the ruler, he reverts back to his own wisdom, his own passions. You see, God wants to reign. It's interesting, the way Israel got its name. Remember Jacob, the heel catcher, the conniver? He was always trying to better himself. He was always looking out for his own interests. And then he wrestled with God. And it tells us that as he wrestled with God, God stuck his hand in his hip and he wounded him. He had a limp from that day forward. And God that day, as God prevailed over Jacob, he named him Israel. And the whole idea is that Israel means that you're now no longer governed by the flesh, but now you're governed by God. And God wanted to be the governor. He wanted to be the one who ruled. He wanted the one who reigned over the nation of Israel. And guys, I think it's a picture for all of us. You see, you and I have that same battle. Either you're going to rule over your own life, or you're going to let God rule over your life. That's the only two options you and I have. You're either going to say, I'm the boss, or you're going to say, God, you're the boss. You can't have both. And God's design and God's plan was that the nation of Israel would always have God as the king. The God is the one who directed the nation. That's God's plan for your life. He wants to direct you. He wants to guide you. He wants to lead you. He wants to be your sustainer, your protector. He wants to be the one who is actively fighting for you and going before you. But you can choose to take that position for yourself. And it's exactly what the nation of Israel chose. It's interesting that God knew that they would make that decision eventually. God was already aware that they were going to want a king to rule over them, just like the other nations had a king ruling over them. They wanted someone who was going to defend them against their enemy. They wanted someone who was going to build their roads and do all of the things that a king would bring into the nation. Let me ask you to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 17. It's interesting that, think about this, we're talking, hundreds of years earlier, God writes Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 14. And watch what God says. Now, just kind of put this in perspective. God is already giving them instructions for the things that he knows are going to happen. That's a wise God, isn't it? When God, even before they make the decision, God was still supposed to be the theocracy over their life, he's saying, when you guys go here, let me tell you, here's some things you need to keep in mind. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, look at verse 14. When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren. You shall set a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself. Now think about Solomon. He didn't heed the warnings that God gave. Why does he say don't multiply wives? Lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom that he shall write for himself a copy of the law in a book from the one before the priest, the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and be careful to observe the words of his law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandments to the right hand or to the left, that he may prolong his days in the kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. God goes, when you revert to this way, let me tell you the only way this is going to work for you. You have to have a king that knows my words, a king that establishes my laws, someone who's got my heart. And he goes, you can't choose your own king. You're not going to choose by what you see or what you want. You're going to choose who I pick for you. You see, God is establishing, how they're to go forward, even when they revert to wanting to be like the rest of the world. And I think, guys, it really is a warning to all of us. There's a tendency in all of us that we want to be like the world. We want to be like everybody else. We want to fit in. And so we want to, be hip and cool and kind of be in the trend. And you got to be careful. Because our tendency is to want those things because that's what cool is in our culture. And God had warned them, don't want to be like the rest of the world. That's not who you are. I made you guys different than that. But here they are, they're going, look, we want a king to rule over us. We want to be like the rest of the nations of the world. We want to fit in. We want all the benefits of it. We want all the things that are going to be, a benefit to us. Now look at verse 6. Look at verse 6. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. Samuel knew that this isn't good. This isn't right. It wasn't God's heart. It wasn't God's intent for them to have a king. God was supposed to be their king. And it displeased Samuel. It displeased Samuel. Samuel's going, but rather than speaking, Samuel says, let me go pray. There's some good advice right there. I can't tell you how many times I wish I would have prayed instead of spoke. If you go pray before you speak, you're going to save yourself a lot of problems. A lot of things that you wish, man, I wish I wouldn't have said that. I've never had a problem saying, man, I wish I would have said that. It's never been a problem. There's a lot of times I said, I wish I wouldn't have said that. And if I would have prayed first, I probably wouldn't have said it. I think Samuel's got something here. He's saying, you know what? He could have responded, you guys are messed up, or what do you guys think? Rather than speak, it says that Samuel prayed to the Lord. And I think that's what made Samuel the man that he was. He was a man who prayed. He was seeking God's wisdom, not his own wisdom. He was seeking God's counsel, not his own counsel. It wasn't going to be something that Samuel was going to respond out of. He wanted to say, God, what do you say about this? And I love his heart because it says he goes and he prays. And look at verse 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me, that I should not reign over them. You see, Samuel was taking it personal. They don't like me, God. They don't even want me. They're rejecting me. They want a king instead of a judge. And God says, Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. The issue isn't you, Samuel. The real issue is that they don't want me to reign over their lives. And I think, what a reminder, guys. You know, how many times when someone rejects us that you know, I take it personal often. When someone doesn't want to hear what I have to say, or, you know, doesn't take the counsel that you give, or just said, you know what, they take their toys and go home, and, you know, you just kind of like, man, what did I do wrong? And, you know, but the reality is that if you're giving God's counsel, then they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting God. Jesus had warned about it. Jesus told us, you know, how many times did Jesus say, look, if the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. Jesus said in John 15:18, he says, in verse 19, he says, if you were of the world would love its own, yet because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they had kept my word, they would have kept yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know him who sent me. Because when you're being rejected, and it's because you're giving truth, or because you're standing for truth, or because your example is truth, understand something, man. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting God and God's word and God's truth. And I think Samuel needed to hear that, because he's feeling like, man, God, you know, what did I do wrong in God's word? And look, listen to what they're saying. Give them what they want, Samuel. Find a king for them. And I think that God continues that thought there in verse 8. He says, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and have served other gods, so they are doing to you also. He says, look, Samuel, this is par for the course. This is what they always do. Don't take it personal. Don't get offended by it, man. They want to go out and run to you know, their old life, or to back to their old vomit. It's nothing you said or you did. They're rejecting me. And that's really what it all comes down to, guys, in every one of our lives, man. Either you're gonna embrace what God declares, or you're gonna reject what God declares. Either we're going to line our lives up with what God's, you know, that's what truth is, and that's what God said, and, you know, God's supposed to reign over my life, and I need to follow what he says, or you can go and do whatever, and God will let you. Heed what they say. And God is going to allow them to do it, but it's interesting that God is going to allow them to do it, but before they do it, he's going to warn them of what it's going to produce, what the consequences are going to be. And God always warns. He always gives the opportunity for you to make a educated decision, or rather, you know, if you really want to go down that road. And you have to weigh that out in your own heart. Yeah, you have to sit back and just go, okay, if I choose this path, this is what it's going to look like. And if I choose this path, this is what it's going to look like. And every one of us will have that opportunity, man, if you have spent any time in his word, man, to make that decision. Interesting, it was just at the end of the book of Joshua, where Joshua, they had just been in the land for, you know, a short time, you know, 30 years. And Joshua stands up and he says to them, if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You see, Joshua said, look, I made my choice. Now you got to make your choice. I know who I'm going to follow, but now you got to decide who you're going to follow. God will always give you a choice. And you have to make that decision. How many of the men of God, all the way down history, all of the men of faith, would have that same decision to make. Remember Moses? It says Moses choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Moses choosing the affliction with God's people rather than enjoying. You see, Moses was in Egypt living in the castles. Moses had everything handed to him. Moses was one of the privileged class. And Moses had to make a choice. Am I going to stay in this position, or am I going to go join God's people and be part of the affliction that's going to come as a result of it? And it says he chose rather to suffer than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. It's also interesting that I think it was Paul the Apostle in Romans 8:18. He said it like this. He says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." I love that. Because I waited out. And I would rather suffer through the things that are happening, now than and then reap the benefits of it when I'm in heaven, and knowing that it's not even comparable. It's not even something that you can kind of go, that's a good option, not to do what God said. And you find that throughout the scriptures, that man has to choose. It's not the easy road. It's not the path with the least resistance. It's going to be the harder road. It's going to be the more difficult path. And the children of Israel are making a decision that, we would rather have a man rule over us. We'd rather have a monarchy than to have a theocracy. And God's going, if that's what they want, then give it to them. You can have man rule over you. You can have your flesh rule over you. You can be your own boss. You can, at the end of your life, say, I did it my way. But the end of it has a consequence. There's an interesting psalm in Psalm 106 in verse 13. Check this out. It says, they soon forgot his works. They did not wait for his counsel, but lusted exceedingly in the wilderness and tested God in the desert. Watch this. And God, gave them their request, but sent leanness into their soul. He sent leanness into their soul. And it's that same picture. He says, God gave them their request. That's what you want? Here you go. But you're going to suffer on another realm, and it's going to be on the soul. It's going to be the spiritual that you're going to suffer. And the children of Israel were going to find this out the hard way. So God gives them the warning. Look at verse 9. Now therefore, heed their voice. God's telling Samuel. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen. Some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over the thousands and captains over his 50s. He will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officers and his servants. He will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take a tenth of your sheep, and you'll be his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you've chosen for yourself, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. There's the warning. Because you want a king? Let me tell you, that king's going to rule you, and he's got a high cost. He's going to take your kids, and he's going to make them his slaves. You want a king? This king's going to take your crops. He's going to take your cattle. He's going to accumulate all these things for himself. And really, think about what's happened. 6 times he says he's going to take, he's going to take, he's going to take. And anytime there's a monarchy, it's always, taking. When it's a theocracy, it's always giving. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Giving. It tells us in the book of Matthew, chapter 20, it's an interesting passage. It says, whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave, just as the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Giving. See, anytime man is on the throne, it's about taking. Anytime God's on the throne, it's about giving. He's the giver, the theocracy. And you gain if he's the one who reigns in your life. You're the beneficiary. You want man to rule. Understand it's going to cost you everything. Jesus would later say, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and he loses his soul? You see, there's always a cost when man rules. But when God rules, man, there's a benefit. Now, I'm convinced that, I would much rather have God rule. He's a much better king than any human king. Now, there's going to come a king, King Jesus, and he's going to have a perfect government. Because he's going to reign with the same principles of a theocracy. And he wants to reign. He wants to reign in your life. He wants to reign in my life. It would be a few chapters down the road. They're going to anoint that king. We'll see that in the weeks to come. Saul's going to come in, and Saul starts off as the humble guy. I mean, they're going to choose Saul because Saul was the best looking guy around. He was a head above everybody else. He was tall. He was good looking. Saul had the strength, the muscle. He was everything anyone would want in a king. And Saul ends up becoming a man that was ruling his own life rather than God ruling him. God's going to choose a man by the name of David. He was a young boy at the time. And it's interesting, Samuel's going to anoint both of them. Think about Samuel's already an old man. I mean, that's pretty clear. But Samuel's going to be around long enough to anoint the first 2 kings of Israel still. He's going to anoint Saul, and he's going to anoint David. And the contrast between these 2 men was enormous. You see, David becomes a type of Christ, and Saul becomes a type of the flesh. These 2 different men with 2 different leadership styles that were going to, rule over the nation. David, more of a servant. Saul, more of a tyrant. And then what's incredible, as you're looking at this whole picture, David was a shepherd. He was just out, caring for sheep. He was nobody. He was nothing. And then God takes that little shepherd boy and he puts a spirit in him. Anointed. He has to go through great testings. He runs from Saul for years on end. He's being chased like a dog. He has to learn how to trust the Lord. You see, God had to form the man. He had to shape the man. He had to break him down so that he understood that it wasn't by his might or his power. It had to be by God's might and God's power. Saul, when God speaks to Saul, he says, Saul, when I chose you, you were little in your own eyes, but now you think you're something. And it's amazing because Samuel here is giving the people, look, if you choose for man to rule over you, understand he's going to become your master. When that was never God's intent. They're going to be giving a tenth of everything to the king rather than to God. That was supposed to be their worship to God. A tenth of everything. Now they're going to give a tenth of everything to the king, and then they're going to give their tenth to God. It was going to cost them immensely. It's interesting. We're living in a culture where, we're already paying like 30, 40% taxes, and there's some out there screaming for 90%. Because that's what happens when man rules over you. Man's never satisfied with what they're getting. 10% will turn into 20%, and 20% will turn into 40%, and 40% will turn to 80%, and pretty soon, well, you can have 10% of your own money. That's what man does. Instead of taking 10%, they leave you with 10%. Because man will never be satisfied. And what's interesting is, we got time. Turn to chapter 12. Same book. We'll be back over here, but I think kind of putting this all together. Look at verse 16. It says, now therefore stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Is today not the wheat harvest? I will call to the Lord, and he will send thunder and rain, that you may perceive and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord, in asking for a king for yourself. So Samuel called to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord. And Samuel and the people said to Samuel, pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die, for we have added to all of our sins this evil of asking a king for ourselves. It didn't last long. We're going to get a king. This is going to be awesome. We're going to do what we want to do. We're going to have an army. And it wasn't long before they realized, you know what? We blew it. We blew it. We thought it was going to be so much better if we did it our way rather than God's way. It doesn't take long to figure out that, doing it your way will never gratify. It'll never be the successful way. It'll always leave you empty. It'll always leave you wanting. It'll never produce what you think it's going to produce. It's interesting, all the conversations in our culture right now. This push to go to socialism. And you're just like, man, we've been the most blessed nation on the face of the earth. We've been granted more than we deserve. And I believe because we've had biblical principles at the founding of our nation, I believe God's blessed that. But now, somewhere along the road, we decide, you know what? We'd be better off doing what the other nations are doing. And you kind of like, what are you thinking? How do you think that's going to work? How do you think that's going to end? I don't think it's going to end good. Because anytime you put man in power, you give man more power and more power and more power, all he's going to do, it's just another opportunity for more corruption. For me, it's the less government, the better. Get man out of it. You know, the less that man has in control, the better off we are. And what's incredible is there's you know, they had to go down that road before they finally wake up. And you know, I'm afraid for our nation. I'm afraid for what our kids are thinking and what they're being indoctrinated with. Because in 10, 20 years from now, it seems to me that that's where we're going as a nation. When this next generation comes up and has enough voting power to put those in power that would want us to go there. I think we're going to be looking back going, man, we had such a great thing going. And we gave it away. I think that's where the nation of Israel's at this point. By the time you get to chapter 12, they're going, man, everything was going good. But we blew it. But they were warned before they blew it. And the consequence for their choices. You know, and I think, you know, guys, that's just on a government level, but how much more so on a spiritual level? How much more so when it comes to, you know, the decisions we make with our life? Who's going to reign over us? Who are we going to follow? Who are we going to choose to make our life principles by? You're going to let your professors dictate to you what truth is? You're going to let God dictate to you what truth is? Are you going to let this world dictate to you what right is? Or are you going to let God's word dictate to you what right is? Because I'll tell you, we're in a world that is broken and backwards. It's just what God says is right, this world's saying is wrong, and when God said is wrong, this world is saying is right. And at some point, man, we all got to come to the decision, which one am I going to follow? Which one am I going to choose? And it's amazing. But watch this. We're not done. Let's go back. Look at verse 19. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like the other nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Notice their motivation. We want someone else to fight our battles for us. They didn't realize it's going to be their kids fighting the battles anyway. And what's also interesting in this whole picture is, up until this point, God had fought their battles for them. Because when Israel went into the promised land, they weren't even an army. They didn't even know how to fight. And they go to Jericho, the first battle they go up against, and God says, go walk around the wall for 7 days. On the seventh day, I want you to walk around 7 times, and then the walls will come tumbling down. Oh, that sounds like a great military strategy, doesn't it? And they do what God says. And just like God says, the walls come tumbling down, and they have a great victory in Jericho. They go to Ai, the next battle. And rather than seeking the Lord, they just go, hey, just send some of the troops over there and take care of those guys. You know, they started to think they were something, and then they get defeated. And they come back and they go, God, why did you let us get defeated? He goes, well, because there's sin in your camp. We got to get rid of the sin. I can't be in the middle of sin, and we got to do some cleaning house. And they expose Achan. They stone him. He had stolen the gold and some cloths from Jericho for himself. And God gets rid of Achan, and then they go and they defeat the next enemy. And again, they didn't have the power to do it in their own. It was God that was defeating the enemy for them. And there's this whole concept that you're either going to try to do this in the arm of flesh or in your own power, or you're going to do this under God's rule and under God's authority. You're going to let him fight the battle, or you're going to fight the battle yourself. Now, I'm much more comfortable with God fighting the battle than me fighting the battle or man fighting the battle. I want God to be my defense. I want God to be the one who sustains me when I can't sustain myself. But you got to choose. And they're saying, no, we kind of like that idea. That's a good idea, Samuel. We like it. We want that king to fight for us. We want him to judge over us. We want him to be the one who rules over us. And Samuel heard all these words in verse 21, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. Wow. I'll tell you, just reading this passage, I was just like, man, I'm so impressed with Samuel. Samuel at this point, could have just went off the handle. You bunch of knuckleheads. What are you, he could have went off on them, but he didn't. He just said, you know what, let me go ask the Lord. Just prayed. He just went and sought God's counsel. God, what do I do here? Watch this. He repeated in the hearing of the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, heed their voice, make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, every man go to his city. You see, Samuel was just simply going to say, God, if that's what you want me to do, then that's what I'm going to do. You guys go home. Let me seek the Lord. Let me come up with a conclusion here, and I'm going to, get back to you on what God says. He didn't go, hey, let's have a committee and let's go find a king and just go back home. That's what you want to do. We're going to go there now. Let's weigh this out. And this whole picture, that God will give you what you want. He will. You can pursue whatever career you want. You can go down whatever path you want. You can follow whatever dictates of your heart you want. You can do whatever you want. God's given you the freedom to do that. He'll heed it. He'll let you. Even though it's not the best thing for you, he'll let you. But understand there's a consequence for doing so. There's an interesting passage. I want to close it here. Go to James chapter 5. I think James kind of puts this whole chapter in perspective. Look at James chapter 5. My Bible doesn't have James. No, I'm kidding. It's one of those books that just kind of hides. James chapter 5. Look at verse 1. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasures in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. The cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned. You have murdered the just. He does not resist you. Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, patiently waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and the latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. And do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as examples of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endured. You have heard of the perseverance of Job, and you've seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. And that passage, just, it strikes me that he'd go and take, those who chose pleasure and luxury. He says, you know what, you're storing up your treasures. It's going to come. He says, but those of you who are serving the Lord, your reward's coming too. The Lord's coming. He's coming. And we've always, you look at Job and you go, man, that's a faithful man. You know what? We count him blessed, those who have endured the hardships, the trials, the tribulations of life, and they've endured it. And he says, you do the same. You endure it because one day your reward's coming too. And your reward is going to outweigh anything else that could ever be offered to you, man, if you would just stay the course. The easy road, rule yourself, do your own thing. The hard road, surrender and allow God to reign over you. The benefits outweigh any of the struggles you'll ever endure. And so it's my prayer, man. It's next week, guys. Samuel is going to seek out Saul, and then we begin the life of Saul. And man, what a tragic life. Started out so good, ended in such a horrible, horrible tragedy. And then we'll get into the life of David, and David, just a young boy who loved the Lord. Most of those Psalms written by David, just a guy who had a heart for God. Matter of fact, that was David's, that's what God declared about David. He was a man after my own heart. I love that. David wasn't perfect by any means. Murder, adultery. He did some pretty vile things. He counted the people. He got his eyes off the Lord. But the thing about David is David was a teachable man. When he blew it, man, he knew how to come back and say, God, I blew it. I need your help. I need your grace. God, don't take your spirit from me. David was a sensitive man to the things of God. And really, that's what God's looking for. He's looking for men. He knows we're all blow-its. I could have used a couple of words there. He knows us. He knows how our tendencies are. He knows how much we fail. God is just looking for a heart that's saying, God, I want you. I want your ways above everything else, God. I want you in my life. When God finds that man, when he finds that woman, he begins to mold them and shape them. He begins to pour his life into them. And then he begins to use them for his glory.